This is Cults and the Culting of America podcast with scholar of cults, extreme groups, and extremely bad leadership, Daniela Mestenek-Young. I'm your host, Scott Lloyd. Daniela, an eventful day for you. I understand that you sold a few books today.
Yeah, Scott. It's a wild time to be an expert on the bad guy.
Well, that's always a good day, right? When you can sell books. And for those of you that are tuning in to our podcast, Cults and the Culting of America, if you haven't purchased Daniela's book yet, you need to do so because it is a fantastic book, uncultured. It is also a great timing with everything that is happening in the country and in the world. So do yourself a favor and pick up that book. And Daniela, I'm really excited about the guest that we have tonight, and I'll give you the opportunity to introduce her.
Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to hear from you, Dr. McAvoy, about narcissistic abuse. Obviously, as we know, this is 1 week post the Donald Trump election, and we are all looking at the fact that almost ironically, right, because we are dedicated to democracy and freedom, we have to hand the country over to someone who is known to be a dictator. And, from the beginning, I have been calling it, he's a cult leader. He is textbook. I would just love for you to tell us a bit about your background and then what you are thinking right now.
Okay, so thank you so much, by the way, for having me on. I'm Dr. Carrie Kerr McAvoy. I'm a licensed psychologist with over 20 years of counseling experience. So primarily until I was widowed in 2015, I had just a practice as a private practice, seeing clients at the office. And as a generalist, I was seeing a whole range of things, depression, anxiety. But I also had a few, believe it or not, narcissistic personality disorders cross my path as clients. And usually because some kind of crisis happened in their life that put them into some kind of tailspin. But in 2014, late 2014, my husband was diagnosed. We had been married 30 some years, diagnosed with a rare form of cancer that very rarely is treatable. It's a terminal form of cancer. And of course, in his case, it was found late and he passed away 5.5 months, which set my life into a big tailspin, being widowed suddenly in my early 50s. And what I hadn't realized was that I had growing up in a home which was extremely conservatively religious. And Scott, I was listening to your story about your religious background. I grew up in an evangelical church, and with a lot of very, very strict moral kind of guidelines. But it was also the home I grew up in had a lot of emotional, coercive control, abusive control pieces to it. And so did the extended family. I didn't realize the degree that I had not healed. And maybe even there's a little bit of definitely patriarchy in my first marriage, but that being vulnerable like that led me to end up getting in a very toxic, abusive relationship. So I remarried again 2 years after he passed away, and married actually sort of like the worst nightmare. You put all the worst pieces of my childhood together into one person. And that's who I ended up marrying. And so I was in this relationship for 2 years. Interestingly enough, I know this shocks people. People don't understand that in psychology, when you're trained, domestic violence, first of all, is optional. So you have to elect to take those courses. And there's not a huge track. It's a very, at least when I went to school in the 80s, it was a very minimal track. So it wasn't like a lot of education occurred in it. Maybe, hopefully it's getting better today, but even personality disorders, you think, well, that's in the DSM-5. It's a part of a diagnostic criteria that you have to consider when a patient comes in, but because it's not supported by insurance, it's not reimbursed, there's really not much focus on it. It was sort of like, yes, we need to be aware there's people who have these types of personalities that it's a character disturbance or disorder of a person, but we focused more on mental health conditions which are treatable, but which also are reimbursable. So that could get us in a whole discussion of why is a healthcare system in the United States like that then puts all of us at risk, because there's massive groups of people who are not getting any kind of mental health services. So here I am. I recognized he was a narcissist, but I hadn't heard the word coercive control, believe it or not. I didn't know what that was. Didn't know what a trauma bond was. Didn't focus on what cults, personalities that happened in cults and stuff. All of that was but elective studies that you had to do if you really had a passion about it. So I ended up in this relationship that was extremely coercive, and yet on the outside, there wasn't any physical violence. Never actually even called me a name. Never called me a name. But the amount of control that I was under, the lack of privacy that I had, just that I became terrified of him. So getting out and getting away from him was really, really hard. And I now suspect also, and this is something I don't know if that you're aware of, Danielle, is that he probably was also poisoning me. He stood to inherit a lot of money, so there was a piece of this that was I was set up. I was set up for a scam so that he could take advantage of the position I'd found myself in because I got widowed. So I got out of that relationship, felt so crazy and discombobulated by it that I like I don't know why you wrote your memoir, but I wrote a memoir called Love You More, and just partly for me to make sense of what happened to me. And then as part of that, then I also really started to do a deep dive into narcissistic abuse, narcissism as a personality disorder, even all cluster B personality disorders. Like, what are they? What are they about? Because I very much wanted to understand the mindset. But what I've discovered is that this is a common pattern and it's happening to a lot of people, which I find extremely frightening. So yes, in light of last week's election, which I've been teary. I've actually been teary about it. It's bizarre to see the degree, even within my own context of my own family, that we selectively choose to focus on what we want to focus on, and we ignore the other pieces of it. And how we can have somebody who actually doesn't, if you listen to the rhetoric, it doesn't make sense. The communication style he's got, it doesn't make sense. And yet we're willing to overlook all of that in order for it to personally benefit us, which is, I would love to know what you guys think and how this, maybe America is sliding into a cult itself. We're going to be a country of a cult. I don't know. So.
Yeah, and I certainly agree with that. And I tell people all the time, talking with friends and relatives, and I've been feeling the same way, despondent since the election. But I tell people all the time, I feel like I've been telling them since 2015, 2016, that, this is behavior, this is rhetoric that we wouldn't tolerate from anyone in our personal lives. We wouldn't tolerate it from our pastor. We wouldn't tolerate it from our school principal. We wouldn't tolerate it from our mayor. We wouldn't tolerate it from our dog catcher. But yet we want to elevate this man to the highest office in the land. And it's certainly, I think there's, and we've talked about it, right, Daniela, that there's something in the human nature that is often exploited by these cult leaders. And I think we are definitely seeing that in the United States today.
I need to pause you guys for a moment. So sorry about that. So I'm back.
No problem.
And now I'm getting power. So that's good. I see it starting to build again.
So we'll pick up on that point, Daniela.
So one of the things that we are seeing here for sure with Donald Trump, I think he is it elucidates this point for me, is called the deification of idiosyncrasy, which is our, very human desire to make excuses for the inexcusable behaviors of our charismatic leader. And, just to pause there, whenever you call Trump a charismatic leader on the left, people are like, Pasha, he's not charismatic. And it's like, if you're under his spell, he is. Right. And so yeah. I have my three rules of cults. The first rule of cults is you're never in a cult. That's the epigraph of my book, Uncultured. Then second rule of cults, I put into words watching the Harry Meghan saga, which is the cult will forgive any sin except the sin of leaving. And then third rule of cults, I think, is Donald Trump and the deification of idiosyncrasy, which is even if he did it, doesn't mean he's guilty. Right. And like you said, he is not even communicating in a manner that makes sense, but he doesn't have to. He can just stand up on that stage and rock to the music and they will fill in the words, right? Because they have bought into this so hard.
Yeah. Are you guys familiar with the book Mask of Sanity?
No,
No.
not.
It was written in the 1950s, I believe, by a psychiatrist who described the fact that and I haven't read it, so I'm just referring to what I know about it, but others have referenced it, and that is that I've read their work. In it talks about the degree that we're blind to the darkness or the capacity of evil of some people, because we believe there's a level of like just normal sanity that we all have to some level, and so as a result we attribute that sanity to insane people. And I feel like that's because, and you see it all the time, where somebody will tell you somebody did something to them, something really horrific. And you're like, well, no, they're so nice in public, or they helped my dog, or they did this really sweet act to my aunt, and therefore they can't be this evil person. That we disbelieve the potential darkness in people because of what we see. And so we're willing to overlook that. And that's a common thing. I think when we look at, even the things that have come out that Trump has done, the sexual assaults and whatnot, we give him a pass, thinking, oh no, it just doesn't make sense. How could somebody who does the things he do, and maybe even in the public eye, be willing to risk those things? But because we just believe this mask, that it's just, I hope that makes sense what I'm saying.
Yeah. This has come up in the conscious homeschooling movement or responsible homeschooling movement, where it's like most people think that there is a limit to which parents will harm their own children. And so they're making kind of like the laws and the rules and the norms with that in mind. But the reality that some of us know is like there is no limit, and
Right.
we need to sort of put more protections there. But
Exactly.
we heard that rhetoric all throughout the 2016 aftermath of the election, right? Like, oh, it's not going to get that bad. People are going to keep him in check. But now, this time, I feel like we knew who he was, and we put him in anyway. And I do feel like you said,
what happens when we
all live in a cult now, And the reality is,
you know what happens when we all get hoovered, right?
No.
Say that again.
You
Carrie?
know what all happens when we all get hoovered back into a relationship, right?
What's
No.
that?
Well, when toxic people, so here's the mindset of a narcissist, and this is like, this is nearly universal, really. We attribute the laws of a healthy relationship to people, and healthy people have these mindsets of, we believe in change, we believe in relationship repair, we have faith in communication, we're willing to forgive. We have all these things that we consider just part of a healthy relationship, but that's not the rules that an antagonistic personality follows by. And they actually will exploit those beliefs against a healthier mind. They understand them. They don't comply to them, and they're willing to exploit them. They see the world in a perspective of it's a competition. It's not collaborative, it's a competition. And in their mindset, you knew what it was like before, and you knew the degrees that they betrayed you before. So you agreeing to do it again, it means you're signing on for this and worse. And they also hold you in contempt because they would have never taken the risk with you again. So why would you give them a second chance? That to them is sort of a pathetic, kind of weak thing to do. So in a way, it unleashes the worst side because they feel like you've essentially given them permission.
Yeah. And
our other problem with him is that he doesn't need to be elected again. So there's no check of, oh, at least I want to appeal to the voters so they vote for me again. No, this is his last final 4 years. He has no reason. He has no really, actually, in that sense, a check. So, and he's very narcissistic, which I can't diagnose him, but you see a lot of narcissistic traits on him. Yeah, I'm very concerned. I think we're going to see a lot of retaliation, a lot of getting even. I think that it's a lot more extremism than we saw before in the first 4 years with him.
Yeah. And, I just want to highlight what you said about like the cult leader, right? The narcissist, like they understand the rules of the game that we are playing by, and they're willing to exploit them. So this was just coming up on my TikTok. I was talking about Shen Yun, which is a false front or a funding like front group for this cult called Falun Gong, which is a Chinese cult that was kicked out of China for being a cult. And then they have like used and manipulated American xenophobia and like fear of China to be like, oh, the Chinese think we're bad, so we're okay. But if you Americans criticize, now we're going to call you racist. And this is what cults do. Like, no matter how well you think you know freedom of religion, cults know it better. No matter how much you think you know equality law, cults know it better. And they will use that and they will manipulate all of those different things against you.
Yeah.
And so that's the conundrum. And I'd like for both of you to speak to this, because I know in the lead up to this election, just like in the lead up to past elections, when you try to advocate for a particular side, or when you advocate against, when you point out the flaws, when you make the arguments, and again, this is something that I did for a living for close to 2 decades. I was a debate coach, and so I know what it means to make a solid, logical argument. But what I'm discovering is that when you share information with people, first of all, they become defensive, and they don't answer necessarily in kind with a reasoned argument, but immediately, right, they go to the ad hominem attacks, things of that nature. But also, it seems that if you attempt to advocate with reason and logic and good arguments, they double down on their positions, and you run the risk of making them even more radical than persuading them to see the other side. Does that make sense? And why does that happen?
Yeah, you're getting. That's a good question. Why does that happen?
I think that it's almost like the brainwashed person will double down on their brainwashing in order to prove that they're not brainwashed. Right. So this is why I think one of the big mistakes that the Harris Walz campaign made was that ad, you don't have to tell anyone who you're voting for. Right. Because like now you're telling them, like, we think you're controlled, and they're like, we're not controlled by our husbands, so we're going to go vote exactly the way, we're not going to vote the way you want us to, which means we're going to go vote exactly the way they want us to. And they know, right? Like, in these very conservative circles, they're talking about repealing the 19th Amendment. Like, they're not shy about, like, they want to take all of the power away from women. And, what I've just observed with cults, it's like, you know that what people are saying is true, but you have all of these arguments for why it's not true, and you will double down on those arguments rather than admit, like, oh, I am under control.
They've done some fascinating studies in psychology looking at how people justify certain decisions. And they found that the more that we spend, in other words, the more costly a decision is, the more that we're going to justify the wisdom of the decision. So say, for example, you spend say that they gave you several types of purses. Let's just pretend we're buying purses. One's an inexpensive version, and maybe another is actually no better quality, but you spent top dollar for it. You're more likely to defend the purchase of that top dollar one because of the rationale you had to convince yourself that it was a good purchase than you would for the one that you picked up inexpensively. I think these relationships, I think there's a couple of things that come into play in our justification for why we want a country that we want and why we have the leader that we want. One is because of that. It's going to be costly for all of us. And so we need to get behind it and then convince ourselves that it was a good decision, even when it wasn't a good decision. I think the other thing that happens is what's called cognitive dissonance. Now, normally when you learn in cognitive dissonance is just the challenge that we face when we're faced between two competing beliefs or decisions, and we know one is better than the other. So we justify why we're going to do the wrong one despite doing when we should do the good one. For example, I might be on a diet, but somebody brings in donuts to the office, and I will justify why I'm going to eat the donuts and break my diet. And that I have to wrestle with that pain inside me, the conflict between my two competing goals between wanting what I want when I want it versus sticking to something that I really intend and set as a purpose for my life or a goal for my life. What happens in these relationships is that we experience cognitive dissonance on another level. The dissonance is we're not for sure who this person really is. They do both things. They are both the good person and the bad person. They're both Mr. Hyde and they're Dr. Jekyll. We keep thinking that we can somehow help this person stay more Dr. Jekyll like, the good guy or the wonderful woman. But unfortunately, the truth of the matter is what they do. That they're Mr. Hyde. That's the real personality. But they keep us confused. They feed us both. We see both sides of this. And because we can't compute, make a decision, we then make no decision at all. And I think what I see is that all of us do that. We do that with anybody that we feel conflicted about. And particularly when it comes to our politicians, we really do that. That we will ignore the practical things that prove to us that this is not somebody we can trust, that this is a person who's really out for themselves, that they are governed by base emotions. We're willing to overlook that because we hope that there's enough good in them that maybe that will override and soften it. So it's wild how we're willing to sort of betray ourselves in this process, or even how our mind betrays us in this process.
Yeah. And this, in cults, we call this come here, go away behavior. And it's like a tool of the cult leader to keep people off their guard, right? And we've seen Trump doing this just with his use of nicknames, right? For like friends and enemies alike. And it's part of that. One of the reasons I say there was like no spontaneous moments of joy in my childhood, because even if you were told, go out, play, frolic, like you were never sure, some adult wasn't going to get mad about something. And, I think that we see that going on. And then in cults, just like you said, it starts off with this love bombing. It starts off with however you got hooked in. Getting hooked in is a positive, enjoyable experience. It's exciting. Everything's perfect. I use the Army as a great example for this. When you're in that recruiter's office, they are selling to you and they are telling you all about everything that the Army will do for you and your life. And then the first thing they tell you in basic training is, we don't care what they said to you, like you're ours now. But, in cults, as soon as the facade cracks when you're inside, we spend all our time trying to get back to that state of perfect, right? If we just work a little harder, if we just do a little better, if we're just a little more perfect or pure, then like we are going to achieve that state of bliss that we've been promised, which is always a lie, of course.
Yeah.
Carrie, I want to return to what you said at the top in the context of a relationship, because I think for most of us, when we experience narcissism coming from someone, it's usually in the context of a family dynamic or a family relationship. So first of all, is narcissism, is it a spectrum? Are there people that maybe have a more volatile version of that, a more harmful version than others? Or is there anything that is redeemable about narcissism as a personality trait?
This is a point of debate among clinicians, and even the terminology of narcissism is under debate. So you'll have different clinicians or different researchers use it differently. I think some people talk about healthy narcissism. What they're really talking about is healthy self-esteem. And I think it's easier for us just to separate that as different than narcissism. I'd like to keep narcissism more as a pathological condition or a character disturbance versus it being just a good self-esteem. But there are periods of development in which we do become a little more narcissistic, and that partly that is a developmental challenge for a child to learn new skills. So whenever that's happening, you see it in toddlerhood and you see it in adolescence where they become very self-absorbed, very me-focused. Part of that is an acquisition of skills. So it's the brain's development of that process. So again, I see that as very different. I don't think because toddlers and teens are narcissistic during those periods that means they have a personality disorder. That's just part of normal maturation. But so But I do think that narcissism itself, if you think of it as a character disturbance, that there are degrees of pathology. And the way I like to think of it is that we all have ego strengths and skills. Things like, how well do you control your emotions? Are you able to regulate them? Do you have the wherewithal to get yourself out of a really bad spot? How much good judgment can you show when you're facing a decision? Do you have insight into why you do what you do? Can you resist having temptations and show impulse control? Can you resist wanting something maybe when it's not good? Can you show like delayed gratification? You can see some of my Christianity showing up there. Resist temptation. It's called delayed gratification in psychology. Are you able to have a good sense of reality? And how do you relate to other people? Can you appreciate the autonomy and individuality of other people? And so all of us vary on these, from really strong to kind of weak or maybe non-existent. What happens with narcissism is there is a group of them that gets impaired. And the impairment we see is there's an excessive focus on self. It's like mentation. It's hard to describe because it's not something most of us do. But if you could peek into their brain, you would find that everything they think of is literally puts them at the center of the world. There is no other person. Everything they reflect on is, how will it impact them? What's going to be the consequence to them? So it's not like, if I step on your toe, if I had a narcissistic perspective, I wouldn't be worried about how much pain I put you in. I'd be worried about whether or not your pain would damage my relationship with you. So it's this excessive egocentric focus. They also have an impairment with self-reflection. So they can't really see themselves in a sense that's realistic. It's very grandiose, very like they kind of see themselves as separate and superior to other people. Like the rules literally don't apply to them. They're above things. They're better than things. They're just superior to people. And then they have this woundedness to the empathy. So it's not that they're not empathic. That's what we get confused. It's not that they're not recognizing feelings in other people, but they don't have because of that excessive mentation, they don't care about its impact, how it feels to you. Instead, they instrumentalize it. They care about how they can use that to their advantage. Oh, you're heartbroken? Okay, so what might be the way in which I could use that to get what I want from you so that maybe you're more, more compliable to me? So they're weaponizing weaponizing your emotional sense. And then they don't see, and here's where they're really broken, they don't see other people as separate from them with their own life, their own dreams, their own wants and needs. They see them as extensions of themselves. So you're no more significant to them than the car they own or the mobile device that they hold in their hand. They don't attribute human qualities to you, human needs, and as a result, they don't respect you because of that. So what happens, though, is based on these qualities, you can be more or less impaired. And the more impaired you are, then the worse it gets, the more malignant. And I think you start to slide towards more psychopathic end. Now, some people say narcissism and antisocial personality disorder are really just extensions of each other, that you start narcissistic and at the far end, you become a psychopath. I actually think they are two discrete personality types. But I do think that there is a group of narcissists who are so conscienceless, they don't have a sense of connectedness to other people, don't respect people, that they do a lot of psychopathic behavior.
What you said about seeing people as an extension of themselves, no different than the car that they drive or the other tools that they might use to elevate themselves, it certainly resonates with me, and it resonates with my experience growing up in the United Pentecostal Church. Because something that I've written about, something that I continue to think about and continue to unpack is this idea of transactional relationships. And because I was so accustomed growing up in that system, as being treated as a tool with my talents, abilities, leverage for the betterment of the group, according to the leader, right? But it really was just sort of bolstering their influence and their credibility with the group by utilizing what I could bring to the table. What I found myself doing is entering the world, right? Once I left that, being handicapped in relationships as well, because I was used to this transactional um, uh, engagement with others. And I had a hard time overcoming that and understanding, that the way that we're wired, um, it should be that people are accepted and loved for who they are as an end within themselves and not as merely a means to an end.
Have you heard
And
of the opposite?
Go
Have you
ahead.
heard the opposite of narcissism called echoism? Have you heard either of you heard of that?
No, I haven't.
So it's based on the Greek mythology of Narcissus meets the nymph Echo, and Echo, because of Echo loses a voice or loses its voice and becomes only able to say the last few words that Narcissus says. So it becomes a reflection of of Narcissus. And the thought is, kind of tying into what you said, Scott, is that some of us have been raised in these systems. And I'd be really curious to think what you think of this, Daniela, because I wonder if this is a problem people have when they get raised in a cult. It is that you've learned that the way to be seen is by elevating, promoting, and hiding behind the personality of the cult person, the dynamic personality, so that you willingly submerge yourself and then elevate them as a way to exist, as having a self that exists.
Yes.
And there's a whole sort of problems that develop in that because, like you just said, Scott, then you don't know how to stand on your own because you expect to be invisible. And actually being invisible is the safest position in these toxic, dangerous situations, because being seen means then you are likely to get attacked or assaulted or misused or even just used. So it's better to keep hidden and in the sidelines in these relationships. But your personality then doesn't have a chance to really grow and become full bloom.
Yeah, so everything you said sounds like the fancy version of what I was going to say, which when Scott was talking about, and I don't know if you'll like my use of the term narcissism here, but I always say that when we're deprogramming from cults, we have to get more narcissistic and less selfish, where it's like, but it is that echoism thing, right? Like we were taught, it's like you never stand out, and if you do, it is like you said, it's to self-sacrifice to help the group, right? It's to use your talents for the group. Even when the army was like this, it was like, you don't want to stand out unless you're standing out for something really good, like running fast. And so I, of course, was the fastest runner, right? But you never actually, and when I say you got to get more selfish, it's like you're breaking yourself for the cult. You're breaking yourself. You're tamping down your personality. You're harming yourself in all of these ways. We don't know anything about self-care when we get out of these, high demand groups. And it's like, so we actually do have to learn to like love ourselves more, instead of like sacrificing for the group.
Yeah.
Which also leads me to just kind of a maybe a lighter question for you is like, so when you explain narcissism, it sounds like a disorder and it sounds like easy to understand. So then what is it with those of us that just love performing? Like people colloquially call that narcissism, right? Like just like I have always been in front of a microphone singing and dancing and I love it, and so does my child, and like the Taylor Swifts of us. It's like we enjoy performing, we enjoy having everyone's eyes on us, but it's not malicious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the developmental psychology would say there's a normal maturation process in which the self gets developed in a couple ways. There's two of many, several critical pieces, but really in infancy, a child's born not recognizing its separateness as an individual. It sees itself as part of what's called the mother-baby dyad. So it's extension of the mother, because it literally was once an extension of the mother with the umbilical cord. So one of the first steps an infant has to have is a sense of, oh, I'm my own person. And that's when separation anxiety pops up. Like, oh my goodness, if this person leaves the room and was to abandon me, I need them. My very survival depends on them. But the next stage that happens, or they sometimes debate which stage comes first, but there's also in that same realm, that same period of time, is two other twin needs that pop up. One is you need to have what's called, we talk about mirroring of narcissists are very good at mirroring. This is the psychology uses it in a different way. We need to have an experience of being mirrored. And this is coming out of Heinz Kohut's work, the 1940s working with residents. He saw a whole bunch of like Chicago residents and realized, wow, we have this need to be very understood, to have somebody reflect back to us what we experience. So for example, if your child skins their knee, part of what this actually is, the child doesn't actually know fully what that experience means. It's the reflection you give to the child that helps interpret that experience. Like, oh, did that really hurt? Oh, let me blow on it. I think I can make it feel better. Oh, here, see what we did. We just made it feel better. And in that process, you actually made the child feel better. It almost was a little bit like magic. But you being able to enter into that experience gave them a sense of themselves and helped them put words to it and help them have a sense of what's happening. But so in addition to that, while the mirroring needs to occur, Kohut talked about that we need to have what's called be the apple of the eye. We need to feel like people see us and think that we're the most precious, special person in the whole world. And that's what parents do with infants. We know that, we see other people's babies and they're like, they're cute, they're a baby, but they're not mine. I'm glad they're not mine. But when we see our own, there's something uniquely different about that infant. I mean, it's like even their poop doesn't stink. Everything's precious. And we just think that like they are the center of the world. Each of us need to have that kind of that experience of feeling like there's no one else like us. And that's important, that we have value because of that. So I think that's what's different, is that's part of being a person. But what's different with narcissism is that actually their sense of uniqueness isn't that they see themselves as worthy among other worthy people. They seem to see themselves as different, as unique, and therefore outside of humanity. They're not like you. Whereas we're looking just to have this wonderful reflective experience where we can celebrate together. Yeah. They're looking for us to serve them.
Yeah. And one of my top red flag for both cults and groups, or leaders and groups, is a focus on your own uniqueness, right? And like that's even what cults give to the to the cult member, is like, you've chosen the right path, right? You're in the top 10%. Like you're doing life right. And one of the things, it's actually in my book, where someone tells me to get over myself because I'm not as different as I think I am. And I'm always like pushing that back on people now, like nobody is unique. Like we all are unique, but nobody is like that unique to the point that it makes them more special than somebody else.
Yeah, to where the rules don't apply to them. Yeah, you got me thinking today, because I was listening to one of your earlier podcasts about charisma, and any of us who have influence, and the social media certainly gives some of us that capacity, is vulnerable to that. But for us to remember that we're one of a greater context, that we're part of humanity. It doesn't separate us from humanity. It just that we get to speak. I don't know, maybe even saying speak for humanity sounds very arrogant, but yeah, it's not our uniqueness. It's actually, here's the thing that I learned when I was writing the memoir, and I really found this powerful, is that the more vulnerable you go, the deeper that you go into yourself, and where you feel the most shame is where the most universal truths are. It's where we're broken that we then speak to everyone. So to me, it's not like emphasizing my uniqueness. It's rather emphasizing my pain so that others can know that they're not alone in that they can join me in that. Yeah.
That's exactly. Yeah. And I think this is what separates it, at least in my mind, right? What separates people that are having influence, or artists or composers or poets or writers, from the narcissistic cult leaders. That's not to say that those other people can't be narcissistic and cult leaders, but the difference is, right, is that they're willing to open up and show you their weakness, show you their vulnerability, show you their mistakes, and they're attempting to build a bridge of that relates to the rest of humanity, instead of building that wall that separates them from the rest of humanity.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so good. And I just wanted to call out this deconstruction tip here, because we like to give those to people. If you grew up as a cult baby, if you grew up in a cult, most likely you did not get that developmental stage that Dr. McAvoy was talking about. And I mean, this is one of those flashbulb moments for me, where I've already written my memoir. I'm graduating with a master's from Harvard. I've just like taken a whole semester on group identity situational identity. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, I didn't get to form a personal identity,
Mm.
And as soon as I understood that, it was like, oh, cool. Now I can go figure out like who I am. And it's so funny because I was just looking at pictures of me like a year or two ago, and I'm blonde. I look very different, and I'm like, oh, that doesn't look like me. And then I look at me now, and I'm like, yep, this looks like me. So I just want to give that to people, that it's like, that's a thing that we didn't get to do. And that's why we sometimes struggle to not have to just stand out and be perfect and be, like before, like I had to be the best at everything because that was the only sort of way I'd ever been allowed to have any sort of value in myself, is if I was just giving 110% and being perfect all of the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I had, when I got out of the relationship, I realized that what I had done was, because I very much submerged my identity, because I have a lot of egoistic tendencies in me that I'm really trying to expunge. But I realized that I used to think that I was safe if we were safe. So I devoted all of my energy into making the we as healthy as it could, which it really couldn't be because he's not healthy. But now I'm realizing that I had to find me, make me healthy, and then we'll be healthy because I'm healthy. So that's been a real big process for me. And it is, because one of the things that just recently happened, I was sick over Christmas and with something kind of serious. It was quite ill. And I live with my middle son, who happened to be out for the night. So I was going to be alone. And it was sort of the critical spot where it could either get better or it's going to get worse. So I called my oldest son, they're all adults, and said, hey, would you come over? Because I'm kind of scared. I feel very sick. And he said, when he got over, he said, not only did he come, but my other son, my youngest son, came too. And he said, when you were on that phone call, I could tell you believed that I was going to tell you no. That, see, I was so invisible that people would turn me down. And he said, that made me sad, because I want you to also know that not only was I more than happy to come, that your other son wanted to come on his own. We see you. And I think I agree with you, Daniela, that I think part of our healing process is to find relationships that help us be able to flourish and take those risks again, all the risks that we've been afraid to take because it's been too dangerous to take.
Yeah.
One of the parts of the family system I grew up in was my grandmother was sort of set the tone. I would say if there was a cult leader in my family system, it was my grandmother, and she was psychopathic. So she was a psychopath and very scary, had relationship cutoffs. For whatever reason, I got to be her favorite. I was the golden child for her, but it wasn't because I earned it or deserved it, or even was the kind of person she would like. Actually, if I had not happened to just fall into the role of being the first grandchild, she would not have liked me. And I knew that. But everybody ran around her and trying to keep her happy. And you really learned the rules, to follow the rules and not to break the rules. And so part of my healing, especially since this last relationship, has been to, like you said, deconstruct on a lot of levels, deconstruct spiritually, deconstruct relationship wise, everything.
Yeah. And when you said that was so powerful that like
I wanted to follow up on go ahead.
It was so powerful to me when you said you had to focus on healing me, because that's what I realized. Like I was very lucky that I kind of like tripped and fell into a healthy relationship finally. But still I was so focused on like us being good. And then that just came like for like a good 7 years that I just had to be like, I need to focus on who I am. And of course, during this time, like I'm still a mom and I'm still a wife, but who I want to be needs to come first. And I'm really, really lucky that I had a partner that was just decided to be along for the ride, right? Like that was a healthy person. And so now that I am much more healed, it's like, now here is this partnership. It's the same partnership, but it's so much stronger.
And I have to say, this is what alarms me that I really don't like, that whenever I get into any kind of a romantic relationship, I immediately start submerging. I can actively feel myself in a way, camouflaging, like submerging myself into the identity of the other person. So that's like, oh, then I can tell that I'm not ready. That's why I love the fact that I'm getting to practice with my sons, where that I can do it. So then I'm hopeful that maybe eventually I can do it elsewhere. And I'm also doing it with my friendships too. So I see myself expanding, but I have to say it's a process. This is a lot of work to really break out of this role that we find ourselves cast in.
And following up on that, in addition to going through that process of rediscovering who you are, or maybe discovering who you are for the first time, what are some additional obstacles that you had to overcome emerging from that toxic relationship? And certainly there are applications for emerging from toxic group relationships as well. So what were some of the additional obstacles that you had to overcome, and what were some of the tools that helped you do that?
Yeah, I think we get out of these relationships, and I have a feeling that, Daniela, you were a lot the same. You don't know what you feel. I mean, I was shocked to find out. Here I am talking with clients all the time about feelings, and I used to give, particularly the men, this challenge. I'd say, set your alarm multiple times a day, use a feeling list, and then find 2-3 feelings. You should be able to list 2-3 feelings of what you're having at every given moment whenever that alarm goes off. I did the challenge myself and found out that I couldn't, because I had been so submerged and also doing too much dissociating or numbing that I actually didn't know how I felt anymore. So that's been a part of it, is to give myself space to feel. And here's the other thing. I learned to cry silently. So I'm one of these people that no matter how much pain you put me in or how much stress you put me in, I'm silent, because being a vocal, or that was dangerous again in this extended family. It was seen as a weakness. So I learned to never make a noise whenever I'm in any kind of distress. I've actually had to say to myself, it's okay to be noisy. It's really okay to cry loudly. You're allowed to do that. So so recognizing that this was not a healthy thing, it was a pathological thing, and actually breaking out of it. I think the other thing I've had to do is work on boundaries. We think that we know what they are, and we kind of almost externalize boundaries. But I found that it really helps me to view it differently. Boundaries actually are. Let's go back to that developmental process I talked about, where a baby realizes it's separate from the mother. One of the first things it realizes, it has skin on. That where the skin is where the baby ends and the mother begins. So yeah, this is my body, and I'm contained inside this body, this vehicle. And that's simply, boundaries are extension of that. It's a description, or it's an expression of you. It says what you like, what you need, what you want, who you are. So for example, I don't like peas. I hate peas. And if I say to you, please don't put in the fried rice peas, and you don't hear me and care about that, you're breaching a boundary. And when you breach a boundary, you're breaching an expression of me. And for me, humanizing that has made it way easier for me to understand the importance and necessariness of boundaries, or even what they are, what my boundaries are.
Yeah, and that's helpful. Haley, our producer, has a question here, and I think this would really be beneficial. And I'll just put it in my own words. She's asking about the fact that a lot of us, when we talk about narcissistic traits, we see that we see those traits in ourselves. And I'll be completely vulnerable here, right? In my therapy sessions, when they do that, they do that little test there at the beginning, and they always come back and they say, well, you're on the spectrum here, and you're leaning towards this narcissistic personality. And when I hear that, I'm like aghast, right? Because everything that you see on the internet when it has to do with narcissism this is horrible. Avoid these people; they'll destroy you. I don't want to be that person, but at the same time, I recognize that either it's developed in me naturally, or it's a result of all that I've been through in my childhood. I have some of these traits. So what should I do?
Well, the fact that you're self-reflective is a really big, huge benefit, because real active narcissists are not self-reflective. They don't really care. And in fact, it's one of the disorders that the person with it doesn't suffer and everyone around them does suffer. So the fact that you feel some suffering suggests to me that you're not that narcissistic. But I do understand that we don't want to be like that. I think the biggest thing we can do is recognize to the degree that we are allowing other people to be themselves. And it's something you said, Daniela, back in that podcast I was listening today, about how cults have scripts, how you're to dress, the clothes you're to wear, the kind of haircut you're to have, the role that you play. The more we constrict people to a role, and we dehumanize them as a separate individual, is toxic. And I think that we can get, if we can see where we're doing that, where people make us uncomfortable and challenge why we get uncomfortable about differences. Like, I'm just going to be ridiculous for a moment. Say you're somebody who has a strong feeling about tattoos. You don't like them. Why? Why do you care about what somebody else does with their body? It's their body. When we see that kind of myopticness in ourselves, just challenging it so that we can then stretch and respect other people. I think that's the best way to sort of break out it, is learn to really respect everybody's right to choose to be different from you or to make you uncomfortable.
So to the extent that you may think you're a narcissist, it's probably a good indication that you're not one, right? If you're being reflective. Okay. Thank you.
The more you're worried about it, and then that's likely that you're less likely you should worry about it. Narcissists don't worry about being. Well, I used to joke with my ex. I'd say, "You're pretty like." It's all the world according to Garp. There's a movie. He'd like let you laugh and say, "Yep, it is," and he meant it. Yep, it is. It was all according to him. So
wow.
there wasn't any capacity to care about how I felt. That was a nuisance to him. So I think the degree that we care about how we're impacting others, to me, puts you much lower on that list.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like growing up in a cult, we were raised inside of narcissistic personality disorder. And one of the things that really speaks to me, this was in a parenting book, but it said, we learn both sides of every relationship that we're in. And so just the same way I learned to perform charisma, I think you and I both, Scott, learned to perform narcissism kind of like as needed to survive in this way. And then I know that I went into perfectionism and superiority and a lot of stuff that comes off as very narcissistic. It wasn't malignant ever, but it was, I think, like I really had to unlearn a lot of those things.
You're describing a defensive structure. You learned to be, that was your way of protecting yourself to survive that. See, in my family, the way to survive it was I had to learn to be extremely compliant and almost non-existent. So my tendency is first fawn and then I'll ultimately freeze. Where others of us learn, no, we need to attack or become increasingly defensive. And I think when we recognize how this isn't a healthy style, that healthiness is never needing to be defensive at any level. It's really allowing other people to be different than yourself and not needing to justify why you do what you do. Just be okay in yourself and let them be okay in themselves and coexist peacefully alongside of each other. Yeah. But boy, most of us don't know how to do that at any level.
And this is where I'm going to throw in my reminder to people that when you're on this process, wear wacky outfits. Because if you've ever been under any kind of coercive control before, you have probably been under appearance control. And appearance control is always part of behavior control. And so reminding yourself that you can literally put on a princess dress and go walk to the mail and not have to explain, like you just said, like you don't have to justify it. You're the adult in your life. You're the captain of this ship and you can do what you want. I know it sounds frivolous, but I find it to be this really important step in like telling yourself that you're your own person and like really learning that. The same way like a top when kids learn to just put on whatever they want,
Yeah, I just recently did a Mind Bloom ketamine therapy 6-session experience. And my first experience was really mind-blowing. And one of the things I realized I had absorbed as a philosophy, and I didn't know that I had, was that being healthy risked being rejected. And that even my perspective of God, that if I was to be more autonomously, more myself, more fully myself, that would lead to rejection. And I thought, that's bizarre, because it actually, if you analyze it, it doesn't work that way. That actually healthiness means we're more collaborative. There's better reciprocity. There's more equality. There should be increased trust, increased respect. It doesn't mean alienation. It means greater permission. But somehow, because of that's the mindset I'd gotten, because of the control, the coercive control level was so high.
That's the control, because that's
Yes.
what a cult is teaching you, right? So Scott
Yes.
and I, from birth, were being taught you're never supposed to be yourself, right? Like you're
Yes.
always supposed to be tamping that down and being this perfect, they call it a pseudo personality in a cult, this like simulacrum of who you're supposed to be. This is why we have the stereotype of the preacher.
Yeah, and I got the same messages.
Right? Because it's like the preacher's kids going crazy. Like, this is why we have this stereotype, because like you had to have your individuality tamped down the whole time you were growing up. And so now you have to go out and like, I always say, you have to have practice at life to be good at it. And some of us like didn't get to like be teenagers and be adolescents and learn all of that stuff you mentioned, like learn to be individuals and develop. So now we have to go through delayed adolescence period where we're being narcissistic again and like learning to be ourselves.
Yeah, learning to fail, learning to rebel. I mean, all of those things I'm having to experience now, which for me as a compliant person, that's really scary.
Dr. McAvoy, tell us a little bit about the resources that you've developed, your books, your work, and how you're working actively to help people survive as you have.
Oh, thank you so much for that. First of all, my favorite resource is my podcast, Breaking Free from Narcissistic Abuse. It's everywhere that you find podcasts. You can find that as well. And every week we take on just very human examples of what healing and recovery looks like, or even deconstructing a toxic relationship. I've also have a memoir called Love You More. It's a very personal look at what a toxic relationship looks like, and kind of gives you, in a way, sort of by my story, a script of what happens inside these relationships and what it took for me to be able to get out. I also have two other workbooks. One's called First Steps to Leaving a Narcissist, which helps people understand what cognitive dissonance is and then challenge their own confusion and break out of the fog, as well as Surviving to Thriving, which is a workbook to help those who are out of these relationships to heal. But I also have a lot of group coaching that I offer, and an exclusive membership club where we meet weekly to just encourage each other, talk through issues, and heal in new ways as we sort of like rebuild our lives as a group. So you can find me on social media at CarrieMcAvoyPhD.com. It's also my website's by the same name. And like I said, my podcast is called Breaking Free from Narcissistic Abuse.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. This is a fantastic conversation, and I feel like we just scratched the surface. There's so much here, and it's timely, right, with everything that we're going through as a nation.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're certainly welcome. Be sure and like and subscribe and share our podcast, Culting of America, with Daniela and myself. And Daniela, folks, I opened the program today talking about the fact that you were signing and selling books, and if someone wants to get an autographed copy of your book, how would they do that?
The link will be in the show notes. So, but I do invite people to come join me on TikTok. This is where it's the most fun, because I'm like writing my new book in public, crowdsourcing it. We're talking all about the culting of America. And as I said, we're in for a wild ride right now, evaluating cults. So please come find me at Knitting Cult Lady on basically any platform.
Absolutely. And I'm on those platforms as well. Feel free to follow me as well. And thank you all for tuning in to this edition of Cults and the Culting of America. We'll see you on the next episode. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Cults and the Culting of America. Be sure and follow Daniela on social media and subscribe to her Patreon page for exclusive content that you won't find anywhere else. Pick up her book, Uncultured. Until next time, I'm Scott Lloyd for Daniela Mestinek-Young. We'll see you on the next episode of Cults and the Culting of America.